Perhaps the most important use of air power in Korea was diplomatic. The peace negotiations at Panmunjom dragged on, apparently unending and unendable. Air Force Chief of Staff Hoyt Vandenberg began pressing for more extensive action. At the same time, John Foster Dulles let the Chinese know that America was frustrated enough to use atomic weapons in Manchuria. Vandenberg authorized the transfer of nuclear weapons to Okinawa in preparation for the time when they might be used. The Chinese got the message, and peace negotiations accelerated. The effects of the bitter police action in Korea lingered on in the Air Force. For the first time in American history, it was recognized both by the Congress and the public that a permanent professional military establishment of huge proportions was going to have to be maintained. Korea was the training ground for the USAF. It endowed a professional force with a degree of discipline that existed in World War II. That same discipline was now reestablished in the Strategic Air Command. The Strategic Air Command built up its strength at a phenomenal rate. For many years, its mainstay was the 10-engine Convair B-36. It was huge and ponderous, but it had the range and the altitude capability to reach any target in Russia. The B-36s were first supplemented with almost 2,000 B-47s. The Boeing B-47, first flown in 1947, took 4 years of development before it entered operational service. There were only 12 in the fleet in 1951. The numbers grew rapidly, from 329 in 1953 to 1,533 in 1958. The B-47, with its in-flight refueling capability, gave SAC an intercontinental weapon of overpowering might. In its early years, it was virtually invulnerable. It could fly too high and too fast for contemporary interceptors to catch. Man, I really love this airplane. It was fast, beautiful, wonderful to fly. The B-47 was also one of the most important jet aircraft in history, for from it stemmed the B-52, the KC-135, the 707, and all the civilian passenger transport derivatives. SAC had as many as 1,800 of these aircraft in its inventory at one time, and when it did, the United States enjoyed an absolutely unprecedented strategic dominance. In the event of a communist invasion of Europe, the USAF war plan called for a concerted attack on the Soviet Union. This was described as the front-to-rear concept. The fleet of B-47s would destroy all targets, from the borders back to the sources of production and government direction. A 6-day attack would have left the Russian armies to wither in the field, their homeland demolished. United States losses would have been relatively low.
We felt that this was our contribution to the peace in the world. And we had to make war so awful. And we had to make our capabilities so responsive and so real that we were anxious to demonstrate it. You know, I would have demonstrated it to any member of the Soviet Air Force, Army, or Navy, or if they'd come over, I wanted them to see what I could do because I knew it was real. To deter, you know, you not only have to have capability, but you got to know how to use it.
There was no invasion of Europe because the Soviet Union was well aware of the B-47's capabilities. But the B-47 was a curious mixture of old and new technologies. Its swept wings and jet engines would point the way to future bombers and to the entire fleet of jet transports that now unite the world. But its structure was based on older technology that did not lend itself to the stresses of high-speed, high-altitude flight. It was soon phased out in favor of a larger aircraft, the Boeing B-52. The B-52 would become the long rifle of the Strategic Air Command. Like the B-47, the B-52 was intended to be a high-altitude nuclear bomber, one that would streak in alone to take out a city.
Some people tried to tell Kurt LeMay that he needed a smaller airplane. The B-52 was going to be too big. He'd need new hangars, new runways. It'd be too expensive. But Kurt LeMay wasn't having any. He told them that he didn't know how long he was going to have to fly the airplane, and he wanted it big enough to accommodate to whatever was required. Well, this airplane, which first flew in 1952, was big enough, all right. It's still flying. It'll be flying in the 21st century. Kurt LeMay got the big airplane he wanted. He also got a great airplane.
The necessary companion to the B-52 was the Boeing KC-135 tanker. It was fast enough to refuel the B-52 without the discomfort and danger experienced by the slower piston engine tankers.
And we bought 600 of them, and that was one of the most fortuitous buys in the world. And we're still using them, and we'll be using them until 2020, and maybe beyond. That's because we bought enough, we bought the right aircraft, and we've spent the money that was needed in order to keep it up. We've re-engined it, we've reskinned it, we've re-stressed it. You know, if you do it right, and that was done right, the payoff comes in a 60-year airplane that's still first rate, still top flight.
The biggest change in the mission, capability, and psychology of the Air Force came about in 1955. President Eisenhower issued a directive to give the intercontinental ballistic missile top priority. By 1955, the size of the hydrogen bomb had been reduced. It was now feasible to deliver one on a missile with a 5,000-mile range. Since 1946, the USAF had been developing nuclear-capable, long-range pilotless aircraft. The Northrop SM-62 Snark was the first intercontinental missile. The next step in missile development was to create a viable intercontinental ballistic missile program. In 1953, an illustrious 10-man committee was recruited by the Air Force to study the problem of nuclear missiles. The group included a young colonel, Bernard A. Schriever, who would become the management genius behind America's missile program. The task was urgent. The Soviet Union had a lead in missile development. The first priority was acceleration of the Convair Atlas. A systems engineering concept was essential. All the elements of a weapon system, including design, testing, production, training, logistics, deployment, and maintenance, were considered simultaneously and analyzed continuously. Because of the urgency of the need, there was a tremendous amount of cooperation in the Atlas program, and also a tremendous amount of risk. The project was blessed by a series of advances in key areas: structure, control, and re-entry. The result was an operational Atlas missile capability by 1959. The Strategic Air Command's buildup in missile strength proceeded rapidly. By 1961, there were 20 missile squadrons, including Atlas, Titan, and Minuteman units. The liquid-fueled Atlas and Titan ICBMs were first-generation missiles. They had reliability problems. The quick introduction of the Minuteman solid-fuel ICBM placed the arsenal on a new, higher plane. The first Minuteman unit of 10 missiles became operational on October 24, 1962, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The missile force was seen by the Air Force to be a newfangled branch that needed and got a different type of individual for service. Their jobs were demanding and important, but missile crews did not feel that they had the respect flight crews commanded. And they knew that they did not have the extra flight pay enjoyed by pilots. It took years of conscious effort to overcome the second-class citizen syndrome of the missile force. That was a feeling heightened by the remote locations of most missile stations. In the 50s and 60s, the Cold War flashed hot with terrifying frequency. The reconnaissance mission was a deadly game of cat and mouse, each side learning from the other. By May 1960, SAC had achieved its self-imposed goal of having 1/3 of its 3,000 bombers and tankers on a 15-minute alert basis. President Kennedy increased this to 50% the following year in response to heightened world tension. The effect of the alert system on families and crew members was devastating. It was compounded by additional training for war readiness. Crew members routinely worked 80 to 100 hours a week, creating single-parent families long before the term became current. But all of this cost, sacrifice, and effort paid off suddenly in the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. In October, a SAC U-2 reconnaissance plane overflew Cuba. It took photographs of Soviet intermediate-range ballistic missiles being installed. The B-52 airborne alert program was intensified. The 200 operational ICBMs were brought to an alert status. In the famous catchphrase of the time, the United States and the Soviet Union were eyeball to eyeball, and the Soviets blinked.
The deterrence is in the fact that it's god-awful. And everybody would say, well, you're trying to make it so awful. You're right. That was why the Soviets didn't challenge us, and that's why we would have thought many times over before we responded. This nuclear weaponry is god-awful.
The rapid growth of the Air Force in size and power was more than matched by the increased demands made upon it. The policy of nuclear deterrence had succeeded. There had been no nuclear exchange. Instead, there was a clear equilibrium. The country remained committed to the use of atomic weapons as a deterrent to all wars, large or small. But the concept of fighting a limited war was about to be put to a very tough test in Indochina. The situation America was about to confront in Vietnam would be uncannily similar in many ways to the war in Korea. The grand roles planned for SAC, with its intercontinental bombers and ICBMs, would not play well in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The Vietnam War would test the United States Air Force in a theater it had no wish to enter.